nexusforchange.org. And today's session is Transcultural Competence, Navigating Cultural Differences in the Global Community. And that's with Jerry Glover and Harris Friedman. And we also have Graham Isaacs, who will be helping me out in the chat room and also presenting and going through some of the slides for their session. So, hi Jerry, hi Harris, how are you?
Hi, how are you?
Good, good. And if you guys have your webcams turned on, you can go ahead and do that.
Okay.
And so Jerry is on the left, Harris is on the right, and they're the authors of the book that we're going to be reviewing today. You guys can do a quick intro, and I'm going to go ahead and make sure that Graham is set up, and we'll get rolling.
Okay, I want to welcome everyone who is here now, and if anyone else comes into the session, when I looked at the registration list, we have a wide variety of people from anywhere from South Africa to the Asia-Pacific region and Europe and so forth, and I'm very pleased that those of you who can will join us. One of the things that I also noticed from the registration list is there's a lot of people that we know, and we're certainly happy you're able to join us. For those of you who don't know, we're glad you're here too. I'll just introduce my co-author, Harris Friedman. And Harris, you may want to say a few words. I'll do most of the presentation today because Harris has had a bit of a malady he's picked up where it affects his ability to talk. And of course, a lot of us are very happy about that. But anyway, I'll turn it over to Harris for a second just so he can say hello.
Well, welcome to the webinar, and I apologize for my voice being a little froggy. I do have a residual cold from some travel to a cold climate, so I'll let Jerry do most of the talking. But if specific questions arise or comments seem appropriate, I will chime in. Thank you.
The way we have this organized is Graham Isaacs is a colleague of ours that is from England, and he is helping with this session, and both in terms of the technology aspect, but also in terms of the content expertise. At the end of near the end of the session today, he's going to talk a little bit about an interactive ebook that he and I and others are putting together that follows on from the topic of this particular book. For those of you who have the book, Transcultural Competence has been out since February. It is published by APA Books, and it's also distributed by people like Amazon, etc. It will be on Kindle soon. When, we don't know, but they've told us it's coming out on that as well. So hopefully you have a copy of the book. If you don't, hopefully you'll be able to get a copy. What we're going to talk about today is to sort of highlight the content of the book without going into all the details. There's quite a bit of material in the 164 pages that are there. So what we want to do is talk about some of the key points. We are going to stop 3 times during the presentation and allow you to ask questions or comment or have any dialogue with us through John and Graham. And then they'll relay the questions to us, and we will try our best to answer them. Those discussion sessions are only about 5 minutes each, but if any of you want to continue the dialogue after today's webinar, please feel free to contact me, and maybe we can set up a Skype call or email or whatever that would be convenient for you. We're quite happy to talk about our book. We're happy about it. We think it's something that is worthwhile, and we hope that you will too. We'll get started now, if we can go to the next slide. All right, so the first thing we want to do is to say that the purpose of the book is to provide an understanding of what transcultural competence is and how professionals can use it in our contemporary world. The first step in developing transcultural competence, of course, starts when we become socialized into our own culture. Becoming competent in our own culture is a very necessary requirement regardless of what culture we're born into. We then later, as we go along in development in life, develop people who don't share our values and cultural orientations. This is the next step in becoming culturally competent and eventually transculturally competent. Eventually, our experiences, travel, executives, expatriates, traveling healthcare providers, and others who may then find that they're dealing with multicultural environments. And that's what many people today consider to be cultural competence or multicultural competence. We feel transcultural competence is what is the final and fourth step in the development of cultural competence. And the transculturally competent person is someone who's able to adapt to a diverse set of social cultural settings without having prior knowledge necessarily of the specific cultures involved. It's sort of a meta level in terms of cultural competence. We can go to the next slide. Okay, and we feel like it's important to clarify that there are many different people and professions that have different ideas about what culture is and what cultural competence is. We feel like there's some prerequisites necessary to be culturally competent and to have culturally competent perspectives. The first thing is cultural relativity. We need to realize that one size fits all is not appropriate, that we need to understand in a globally diverse world that we have to be able to understand there are different ways that different peoples around the world have taken paths toward achieving the particular cultures and values that they have today. We also need to develop synchronic and diachronic perspectives. It's important to see the breadth and the depth of social cultural situations and be able to realize that there's a history and there's also a variation within the human range of variation on all particular issues, whether it be going to meetings or how people use technology or the values behind family or whatever it might be. We also believe holistic perspectives are important. Being able to see the whole as opposed to looking only in specific parts of your organization. Probably most importantly, we need to understand our own cultural biases. All of us have cultural biases, whether it be professionally given or whether it be from our own upbringing. Regardless, we have cultural biases. We need to understand those and how those will affect us when relating to people in a culturally diverse situation. And then we need to learn to use appropriate tools and methods, such as having a framework. We use the cultural values dimensions. Certainly, Trompignard and Hosted and others have made those famous. They actually come from the work of Parsons and Kluckholm and others, Hall earlier on, who've been pioneers in that area of developing cultural values. We have social cultural encounters is something we use. We feel like that's an important way to define the setting for interaction, and we find that's a good way to frame everything. That is discussed in all these things are discussed, of course, in length in the book. And of course, we use the concept of reconciliation, all those are just appropriate tools allow us to develop our methods for achieving transcultural competence. Next. Okay. Now, just to give you an idea, there are cases that we use in the book, and certainly we have many cases in the book, as those of you who have seen the book know, that illustrate the need for cultural competence. You see 4 examples here. One, we start in the first chapter talking about fishing in Fiji, which is a group approach to fishing, and it's called Yabiorao. And their particular way of fishing is to get in a circle in a tidal pool and then move forward, making lots of noise and hitting the water with palm fronds and so forth, till the fish go into a pool. Then when the tide goes out, they're able to achieve quite a yield, and it's a very productive way. People who are from the outside who've been in Fiji have often looked at this method and criticized it simply because it's different from their own. And of course, using a single rod and reel or using nets or whatever are other methods that people use for fishing. But it's important that people have not dismissed some of the traditional ways of fishing because they turned out to be quite productive. This one, of course, is based on collective values. The hookah pipe situation came for us. Harris and I did a project with the Department of Defense, in which one of the military persons in one of our focus groups and training sessions brought up the dilemma of a hookah pipe situation, where they were invited, he and several other soldiers were invited to go into a village in Afghanistan, meet with elders, and try to identify where some weapons might be hidden. As they went in, they had to develop rapport with the locals, and the first thing to do was to meet with the elders. When they arrived to sit down with the elders, the first thing happened was they were offered a hookah pipe, in which they suspected, and were probably correct, that there was some more than just tobacco in the pipe. And of course, the dilemma was, do they smoke to gain rapport with the elders, or do they refuse it and run the risk of not being able to carry out their mission? That's described in detail in the book, but it's another good example of how sometimes people have to make decisions even when it goes against their own culture, and of course there were lives involved, and the military people who told us this story said it was very important because they feel like they had to find some way to reconcile this difference of expectations. Gift giving is the next example. You see there a situation where quite common in international business that people will give and accept gifts. Yet in the U.S. it's often seen as bribery or some sort of do not do instructions from the Home Office. Unfortunately for many people who travel in expatriate positions, they find that they have to do something in the way of giving and receiving gifts because it is just the way you do business. And finally, the last slide, the last photograph there is in patient compliance. When you have Western trained doctors operating, for example, in a migrant health clinic, there's often an issue of compliance because the medical models are quite different. The belief in germ theory of disease isn't always shared, and if we had time, I could tell you hundreds of stories in the healthcare field and in mental health and so forth, where compliance is no longer, isn't necessarily achieved simply because the people have cultural differences in the way they see healthcare and receiving it and giving it. Okay, next one. And if you look throughout these various fields, I won't go into each one of them and discuss them just because of time, but we do see, there's a lot of different areas where healthcare is extremely important. Business, education, military, government, all around the world in the various professions of people, we find they're dealing with cultural diversity and cultural differences, and it doesn't take long if you do a Google of transcultural competence or cultural competence in business or education or any of those fields to find that there's a tremendous amount of interest in the field, and there's a tremendous number of people who do indeed see a value to understanding the need for transcultural competence. Okay. All right. That leads us now to our next section, which will be a quick pause for questions. We need, because of time, to make this a 5-minute session, but is there anything that has come up in the chat room, John and Graham, that we might want to address? If you haven't put it in there, go ahead and do it now. We'll give you a second.
Yeah, I think that's good, Jerry. Give them a couple seconds to see if there are any questions in the chat room. We've just been having a discussion around where people fall on the culture competence scale that you guys had.
Yeah, you mean the 4 steps?
Yep.
Yeah, that might be something to at least quickly mention. What we try to make the point in the book, and I just did a few minutes ago, is that cultural competence comes in stages, and our intention in writing the book and our intention in talking about transcultural competence is we feel like it's important to go beyond the kiss, bow, and shake hands phase of cultural competence, and goes beyond just having specific knowledge about what other cultures are, and how to operate in them. I think it goes to the point of saying that you need to be able to have a certain generic knowledge about what culture is and how it works, so that you can go into situations and read the cultural cues and at least avoid faux pas. Understand the fact that in meetings around the world, everyone has meetings, but the meetings have a very different appearance and they have very different values behind them. Often you can go anything from meetings where everyone follows an agenda to meetings where people do 3 or 4 things at once and might be quite appear quite chaotic to an outsider who's used to having an agenda and a very sequential process. Anything else on that?
Yeah, Brenda wants to know, are you seeing more organizations actually formalizing their transcultural competence training?
Well, I think the transcultural competence training has been around, at least cultural competence training has been around since the mid-'80s in particular. And I think one of the 2 people who've been very instrumental in that have been Gerd Husted and also Fons Trompenaars. I've had the pleasure of working with Fons since the mid-'90s, and I can tell you that at least with regard to his profession and to his involvement, there's been almost all companies are now looking at the idea of having some sort of training or understanding of cultural competence and transcultural competence in their repertoire of how they deal with their employees and managers and executives. It's gone from more than just training executives to the fact that internally within organizations there's a lot of cultural diversity, and they're also looking at that. And you can, if you want to add to that the idea of organizational culture and other aspects of culture, just the idea of using the term culture, using the concept of culture, and understanding the methods behind it. They're all related.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jerry, and thanks, Brenda, for that question. For everybody else, let's just go into the next section, Jerry.
Okay.
And yeah, and then we'll come back.
Okay. We got time at the end if there's more questions. All right. One of the things that I've been very happy with is a case that I wrote back in 1996, 97, based on my work in Fiji and also my work in the Caribbean. So I put together something called the Blue Horizon Cruises, and that is one of the cases. There's probably 20 or 30 cases. I don't remember how many in the book, but this is one of our highlight cases we've used all along. Had the good privilege of having both Gert and Fons help me with this early in its development. Since the 90s, I've used it for 20 years almost in a variety of settings, and I think, I'm not sure if Lauren or Marinus are on the call, but 2 people from Accenture have been using it with the World Food Program, and we've used it, of course, in many other settings. But the case is a good illustration of and a good way to illustrate and to train people in cultural competence and transcultural competence. We use with that the 4 steps of cultural recognition, respect, reconciliation, and realization. Those are 4 steps developed by Fons Trompenaars, and the case itself allows us to illustrate those 4 steps. The case involves economic, community, and organizational development and change, and the focus of the case is on a stakeholder meeting to discuss the four particular problems of development and change. Now, this particular case came from a real life case that I was hired as a consultant to go in and work on, and the idea came from me to make it more generic, of course, and Blue Horizon, of course, is just a made-up name, but the actual case was pretty much based on what went on in a cruise ship company growing in Fiji. Had rapid growth over a 10-year period, and so the cruises kept going into these small, pristine areas of the Osawa Islands and dropping anchors. And of course, the reef was getting damaged quite a bit by all the cruise ship activity. They also had things like trinket tourism going into the local villages. By trinket tourism, I'm talking about using gifts and trinkets from Taiwan and other places, and then selling them in Fiji as if they were originally made there. Of course, it was also creating quite a level of dissatisfaction among the tourists to go to a somewhat pristine island and find that they were buying trinkets from Taiwan, and it wasn't the original product that they had hoped to go see. There was also potential conflicts between the traditional chiefs and village vendors. Village vendors were wanting to create a cash economy and a market economy, whereas the traditional chiefs wanted to keep the whole idea of redistribution of everything coming to the center and then being redistributed back out to the people in the village. And then finally, the government had an agenda based on Western economic development that was not in agreement with the traditional way of doing things in the village. So they had 4 problems that we identify in the simulation. And if we can go to the next slide. The four R's that I just mentioned, recognition, respect, reconciliation, realization, are ways of dealing with culture and cultural differences. And as I said, those are based on Trompinar's work. And let me give you some examples of that with the next slide. Recognition is the first step in understanding cultural differences, and in the Blue Horizon case, the various stakeholders are described with their values and with their orientations and agendas, and it allows the learner to be able to see what the differences are. Now, even though this is a case in the South Pacific and is a cruise ship and so forth, we've used this in boardrooms in New York City. We've used this in Paris at conferences of behavioral psychologists. We've used this in a number of places, and for some reason, people identify with the idea of cruise ships, and they identify with the stakeholders that we've described in the situation. So why, can't completely explain, but it seems to make sense. The owners and the other stakeholders associated with them with similar values for economic development, for the market principle, for the idea of individualism and many of the Western values, they see those problems that are being faced, the reef destruction, decline of village life, decline of power, and trinket tourism, as areas of conflict and not necessarily areas to be reconciled. They see it as the chief is stubborn, the environmentalists are out for their own agenda and so forth, and there's no real value there for reconciliation. The chiefs, on the other hand, and others like the environmentalists, see it as preserving traditional resources and village life, and they see the problem as a we versus they. We versus they. It's us against them. They've come in and they're trying to take over our country, etc. So we go to the next one. Respect, the second step, is understanding the stakeholders and the values. One of the exercises we do in the case is to allow people to chart the cultural space. So we see who has the most opposite viewpoints and position, and then in the meeting we allow people to chart what we call the cultural space, showing the differences between the most opposite values and how they look at these problems. Okay, next one. Reconciliation is the third step. That's a fairly lengthy process, and it's something that, once again, based on the work of Franz Trompinar's, and of course I've used it quite a bit myself, but Franz's ideas mainly. There's some basic steps there. You start off by first clearly identifying what the dilemma is, whether it's smoking a hookah pipe or reef damage or whatever the issue would be, whether it's home office personnel policies being applied in the field and the people in the field don't agree with it because of their differences being different from the home office, etc. It can be in a number of different dilemmas could be involved in these steps. Then what you do is chart the cultural space. As we said, we have clear instructions in the book about how to do that. I won't try to do that here. But it's mainly identifying the opposites and where they are in terms of the values involved in the dilemma. Analyze the strengths and weaknesses. We look at the idea of what are the strengths and weaknesses of the most opposite positions and how can they indeed be put together and create what we call a new box. Okay, a new box is new ways of dealing with old problems. And what we see is the reconciling dilemmas is really a creative process. It's really a way to put together new ways of doing things that weren't there before. And of course, in doing so, we take the strengths of both sides. And then the next thing, of course, once a new box has been agreed to, we assure that the stakeholders buy in for that idea. In the Blue Horizon case, one of the things we looked at was the whole idea of reef damage, and in the reconciliation meetings and solving the dilemma, that particular dilemma, a reef damage was avoided by implementing a mooring buoy outside the reef where the ships could go tie up to that mooring buoy. So it allowed ships to come in but not do damage. And so those kinds of things are the ideas of combining into new ways of doing things. Okay. Next. And the realization of cultural differences. Realization is simply making it fit, making it stick, institutionalizing the differences, the new way of handling the cultural differences. I won't go into those particular aspects, but they are covered in the book. Okay. Next. And pause here for a few seconds if anyone has questions about the Blue Horizon case or about the methods of the 4 steps. We've covered it very, very quickly, but there's a lot more detail in the book. In fact, each one of those 4 R's is a chapter in the book. We have a chapter on, of course, respect, recognition, reconciliation, and realization. And we use cases and like the Blue Horizon to illustrate that in the book. Okay? Questions?
So as they're paused, if there are any questions out there, make sure to put them in the chat room or either on or in the GoToWebinar questions tab. There was a reaction from Warren who said that was a brilliant case, and thanks.
Sometimes it's not so easy to reconcile dilemmas, like with the hookah pipe. The person who told us about it ended up sitting there smoking the hookah pipe all day. But when he left the village, one of the elders came up to him and said, if you're looking for the weapons, they're over there. And he didn't have to mention it at all. So what he thought is that even though he violated military and DOD policy, he was able to hopefully save some lives and carry out his mission. So it's all a value judgment. Anyone else? Harris, did you have anything to add now?
Well, I'm thinking with the hookah pipe dilemma, one of the military participants in our focus group said that a soldier who had smoked the hookah pipe was turned in by another soldier to the military authorities for violating the law, the U.S. Military law of justice regarding smoking. So one of the things that made this dilemma so important, I think, was that the responses of the soldiers, whether they would smoke or not smoke the hookah pipe, was so high stakes, and that the soldiers were pretty evenly distributed in terms of their opinions about smoking or not smoking, showing that there's no clear answer, no one way fits all.
And it's just like with gift giving, there may be laws about gift giving in companies or even in certain countries like the U.S., but the fact of it is, in the real environment of the global community, people don't see everything the way that people who believe gift giving is wrong. They don't see it necessarily as the way to do things in other countries. And so that's part of what makes it a dilemma. It's all based on values, it's all relative, and it requires creative solutions to be able to meet the needs of both sides without creating conflict. Okay, any other? John? Or Graham?
No.
Okay, if we can go on to the next section then. We'll wrap up our discussion of the book, and before we get to the the section on the interactive ebook that's following, I want to talk a little bit about the way we summarize the book. We use a phrase, a proverb from Samoa: "Catch the pigeon, look out for the wave." And it describes, if we can go to the next slide now, describes the dilemma that often comes up in leadership change and adapting. We often focus on the change initiative itself or the actual need for a specific change initiative without understanding the cultural context. And we think it's important to realize that transcultural competence is an essential aspect of change and development in today's world. And without understanding the actual change process itself, we also have to understand that change models themselves are indeed based on cultural values that someone has. So whatever it might be, if it's a pay-for-performance system based on individual merit and based on individual behavior and on achievement, as opposed to a system based on group values, based on ascriptive values and so forth, we find that things like performance appraisal systems are often implemented as change initiatives, yet the cultural context that they have to operate in are not always considered. So we feel like it's very important to watch out for the wave. We'll go to the next one. Okay, now that takes us to what we want to spend our last part of the maybe 10 minutes or so, and then we're going to have time for plenty of questions, hopefully, and discussion, since that's one of the things we want to do is to make the session so that we could talk about the book. But one of the things that's in process right now is Graham Isaacs and myself and some others, perhaps that some of you may be even on the call, but we're going to be putting together an interactive ebook on leadership, culture, and change. And it follows on to what was in Transcultural Competence, and we thought it was important to let you see where we're going to take this whole idea that we started with Transcultural Competence. And so for that, I'm going to turn over to Graham Isaacs and let him talk a little bit about interactive ebooks and then what we have in mind for the proposed book that's in development right now. Graham?
Thank you, Jerry. I hope everybody can hear me. Thank you. If you move to the next slide. This is a couple of examples of interactive ebooks that I've created in science, technology, and medicine publishing. And I worked with Jerry and Fons Trompenaars on a recent project on transcultural competency. And one of the things that was quite clear from reading some of Jerry's titles and Harris's was that how much they're character-based and how much those could be enhanced by being made into an interactive resource. So I've been working with Jerry and others to look at how we can make this book into a more interactive version. So using techniques from the world of e-learning, STM publishing, and digital education, we intend to develop an interactive version of Jerry and Harris's title. We're going to base it on the 10 chapters, and mainly consisting of real-world global cases in which the reader will become an active participant. And for example, what we'd like to do is have the reader select one of the roles. So if we use the Blue Horizon cruiser scenario, the reader would select one of the characters and assume the position of that cultural competency. And the readers will be presented with different dilemmas in which they make choices of how to interact with the other stakeholders. So hopefully we'll really be able to bring the cases that Jerry and Harris have worked on over the years to life and really embed that learning and knowledge with the users of the books. Do you want to move to the next slide? Yeah. And we're going to base this on the six-step dilemma approach developed by Trompenaz, Hampton Turner, and Williams to help reconcile these dilemmas. And as opposed to a recent project where we were asked for what is the right answer, that is not going to be our focus. It's going to be the focus on how we develop ways to stimulate cultural dilemmas and reconciliation using the process from Trompenaz. We're also looking at different forms of functionality and interaction. So, for example, we could include pre- and post-diagnostic testing linked to the Trompenaz assessment scale, or just check current knowledge at pre- and post-learning. And these are some of the concepts that we've been looking at to make the title more interactive. But we'd love to hear about your ideas to bring Jerry and Harris's content alive with real meaning for professionals wanting to improve their transcultural competency. I think we've just got another couple of screenshots on the next slide, John. So these are slightly less gruesome. The one on the left was for it's actually a cognitive behavioural therapy based interactive ebook for people suffering from mild to moderate depression and anxiety, which I worked on with a professor from Glasgow. And the other one there is an interactive ebook on dental techniques, which was slightly gruesome, but we've had great feedback from the learners on that one, on how to add that sort of extra dimension to the learning content.
What's exciting about this, Graham, and one of the reasons why we've talked about it is that is the reader would go into a book like this, and in each chapter they would actually be able to immerse themselves in the case that's there, making choices and playing a role based on the case that was described. So if you do look at something like the Blue Horizon case, they would be given a character to play, whether it be the chief or the owner of the Blue Horizon Cruises or a government official or whatever, and then they would be able to emulate, to simulate what it would be like if they were to go into a meeting with them and make certain decisions about some of the problems they were facing or some of the discussions there, and they would get feedback so that they could then somehow branch and see the options for their behavior. So it would become an interactive learning experience for the reader, not just a thing where they read the cases and moved on to the next chapter. So we have a great enthusiasm for this book because we think it's going to not only expand the idea of interactive ebooks, but also give us a chance to use cases in a more effective way in learning and development and in transcultural competence. Graham?
That's a really good point, and I think what you've mentioned, and I think to actually bring your cases to life by being interactive will be a really good learning experience, and I'd be eager to see what the feedback of that would be.
And if you have read the Transcultural Competence book, you'll know that it's loaded with cases, because we feel like those are very important, particularly when we're dealing with a subject such as transcultural competence. Okay.
Yeah, I might add in that Jerry and I have been working with the Department of Defense to build very complex and costly computer simulations to do this type of immersive product, and to be able to put this into an ebook that doesn't have that same level of complexity but still engages people this way, I think is just a really exciting development beyond just a regular book in which people are more or less a passive recipient of information being conveyed to them.
Okay.
Cool. Thanks, Harris. That's a good, another good explanation for that. There's a couple questions, Jerry. One, and were you guys going on for the rest of the?
Yeah, you wanted to move to the next slide then? So I think that is question next, isn't it?
Okay, good.
Yeah,
so there was. Go ahead, Jerry. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, there was a couple questions out there. One was from Jacqueline, and this is back on the steps of of culture and the framework that you outlined in your second section. So is realization akin to resolution?
Well, the whole process is akin to resolution. Realization is once you come up with a new box, and I would call them new boxes rather than outside the box, because outside the box means you still got the same box, but you're just working from it. And the reason we call it a new box, and that's just another term for the solution itself, is because it requires a combination of values and expectations in the design of how things will be done to reconcile the solution. So realization is where that's made to happen. It would first involve the buy-in, and hopefully the process of reconciliation will start that buy-in process, but it also involves the idea of creating change in the organization. One of the things that I've had decades of experience with is implementing change projects and helping to do that in various organizations. And one of the things that often happens is people come up with the change design, but they don't actually make it happen. And that's basically embedding the change into the way people do things. And that, particularly when we use the 4 steps, the idea is, of course, that you go through the process of getting people's buy-in and gaining their involvement in the new solution. That means that hopefully the process of realization will be easier. So, in a sense, it is resolution in that it's the final step, hopefully, in getting that 4-step process of transcultural competence and resolving dilemmas into place. It's a way of thinking about problems. It's a way, really, of doing things, and it's a way of treating and dealing with issues anywhere from conflict resolution to implementing new change to dealing with cultural diversity, to dealing with simple things like expatriates overseas, dealing with giving and receiving gifts. So it can be on a personal level, it can be an organizational situation. It's an approach to dealing with change with respect to culture and the idea of needing to adapt. I don't know if that answers or not, Jacqueline.
Yeah, Jacqueline responded that did answer her question, and it makes sense. Suzanne was wondering about examples in a domestic setting where cultures are clashing due to indigenous and non-indigenous and/or new immigrants.
Yes. Would that be in Canada?
She sent a case for hers in Canada, and
Yeah.
she was wondering, and I think it would be good to have a discussion around if there are any of those in your book where any of those types of dilemmas.
Where you have traditional peoples and outside influences, either from a different government within the country or some kind of merger or acquisition in a corporate sense. Yeah. The thing is Tusi Ableo, who I was hoping we could get him on the call, but I haven't been able to find him. I think he's in Samoa. But he and I worked all over the Pacific for approximately 15 years in dealing with, for example, the conflict between Fijians and Westerners and Indians in Fiji, conflicts between corporations coming in and taking over and merging with other organizations and imposing their corporate will on the acquiree. That's very common. Graham and I worked on a project with a major healthcare firm with over, I think it's a $35 billion company that has organizations all over the world, and one of their major issues was acquiring smaller companies, and there was quite a discussion in the interviews I did with people in the company regarding the takeover process, how it happens or how it doesn't happen in terms of making it a culturally agreeable process, if you will, and that comes from the transcultural competence of the people involved in it. Does that help, Suzanne?
Yeah, I might add in one case that we did include in the book involved working with a Native American tribe in America, in which a young boy was having a lot of behavioral difficulties, and the traditional way that the culture addressed that is to have an adult male who was not part of the immediate family but related, typically an uncle, take the child who was having these difficulties, and with a complicated ritual, literally ending and scratching the child with an eagle claw. And this was clearly against the local state laws regarding child abuse, and yet it was a very effective intervention that Native American culture had used for hundreds of years. So how to reconcile that tradition with the Western perspective of what is child abuse and what is appropriate or not appropriate for disciplining or educating a child, and we talked about that in terms of how we went through the different processes of the 4 Rs.
Yeah, and I think if those of you who, if you read the book, and I highly hope you do if you haven't, you'll find that basically our approach is based on the fact that there's no right or wrong in a culture relative world. There's certainly strongly held values, and there's certain things that we ourselves would find distasteful or wrong, but the idea is that you approach all problems from trying to understand the various stakeholders involved, and you try then to understand their values and why they're behaving the way they are. There may be situations where there's legitimate legal reasons for doing things. There may be reasons why you don't do things, but the important thing is in understanding cultural dilemmas or cultural conflicts or cultural situations where there are different stakeholders with different values, that it's very important to understand the different perspectives and how those people got to those particular situations. And that's the essence of our book in a lot of ways. When we go through, we have cases that deal with a lot of different situations, anywhere from corporate boardrooms to dealing with traditional peoples, to dealing with various professions, whether it's healthcare or government or military or whatever. And we've tried to make it a broad-based book in that regard because we don't feel like cultural competency or transcultural competency is a discipline-specific skill. It's something that all professionals need, particularly if they're dealing with people and particularly if they're dealing with a culturally diverse world. Other questions?
Brenda said that she loves the book and she's waiting for the next one. Graham said, Graham, if you're still a panelist, why don't you bring that reaction into the session?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I was chatting with Jerry about this a couple of weeks ago. We have an interesting case in the United Kingdom where we have a bit of a culture clash between two groups of immigrants. And this is locally, it's in a city called Sheffield, a former steel and manufacturing city. And it's where the first and second generation Pakistani immigrants who've been born in the UK are now clashing with Eastern European immigrants, typically from Poland and Romania, who've come to settle here. And they've moved into what was traditionally the Pakistani areas of town. And there's a big culture clash. And I think one of the complaints was the Romanians stand outside the houses and talk a lot. We don't do that in England, apparently. So there's lots of tensions, and there's been some violence and some crimes between the two communities. So it's just interesting to see, especially as a lot of the complaints are coming from first and second generation children of immigrants, essentially.
Good one. Yeah. And what we're trying to do is to get people's awareness of the fact that what we're dealing with is a pervasive and a very common issue that everyone deals with on a daily basis often. And all you have to do is turn the news on, and you can see 10 examples in a half-an-hour news program of the inability of different ethnic or cultural groups to see things the same way. News media themselves in certain countries often reflect the values of whatever particular political dogma they are representing. Educational programs, the same thing. So we're trying to get people to realize with this first book why it's so important. And with the book we've got planned, the interactive ebook, we're trying to allow the reader to go in and actually experience some of the situations so that it's good good practice, if you will, for the real world. Any other questions?
Yeah, and Jerry, I put the link in the Chatsy room. I'm also going to put it in the chat room for GoToWebinar, but Suzanne said it was a great book. She said university courses dealing with international business should use it as a textbook. But Lauren Sirota wants to know when is it coming out, even though I know that it is already out. But she also wants to know what's the average cost for the book.
Lauren, you have a copy probably in your mailbox today that I sent you. But the cost of the book is approximately $30, depending on the print version, depending on where you get it. But I think it's $30 with APA books, $32, something like that. And if you're an APA member, it's $26. I think with Amazon, it was around $30. And I'm not sure how much the Kindle version is going to cost. They have had specials on pre-release specials where the book was selling for $23 as a pre-release. So it's fairly reasonably priced. But Lauren, yours should be there soon. Lauren,
yeah, she was wondering for the price on the ebook.
Accenture, I believe, that was one of the people, one of the professional groups that was using the Blue Horizon case with the World Food Program, if I'm correct.
She was wondering on the price of the ebook, but you said you weren't sure on that.
Oh, well, I don't know, but it won't be. I don't think it'll be any more in the printed version. They won't give us specifics according to APA Press. It's really up to Amazon as to how they set everything up. They give them the book and then they put it in there. But apparently, I know Amazon. Every time I go into Amazon to check the site, I click the please show this on. Please make this book available on Kindle. And I've probably clicked it about 50 times in the last couple of months. They should get me the idea. I don't know if anyone else has. But if you have it, go in there and click it. We want to let Amazon know we need it now. We were hoping to have it sooner than now. But the interactive ebook, of course, will be available virtually. That's our main format for it. Right, Graham?
Yep, that's right. And you're right about Amazon. It's as they once told me when they worked for a big publisher, it's their playground and they set the rules. So they can tell the big publishers what price to set, and they can also do their own discounting to suit.
Yeah.
But yes, the interactive book will be available on all devices, tablets and smartphones.
And please keep in mind today that we really just tried to highlight some of the content of the book, and there's a lot more in there in the Transcultural Competence book that we did not feel like it would be appropriate to try to spend an hour session to go through into all of it. So we really tried just to highlight things to give you some interest in it. If you've read it already, hopefully it embellished what you read. If you hadn't, hopefully it'll encourage people to go and read it. But we've got time for a few more questions, one or two more, I think, John.
Yep, I'm going through, and so I put in the chat room in Chatsy and on GoToWebinar any other closing questions, so we'll give people a couple seconds to fill those out. I'm going to go ahead and
remind everyone, if you think of something later on or want to have a discussion about this, we're more than happy to talk about it with you. So please, contact me or Harris or Graham or John, and we'll get back to you either in an email or a discussion. That's part of the reason for doing the book is we've kind of felt like we need to change people's approach to culture a bit, even though not that everything that's being done was bad, but we felt like we needed to come across with a little bit different perspective, and that's what I think Transcultural Competence presents. And the same thing goes for the interactive ebook. We're hoping that we can get a different way of learning about culture and leadership and change and adapting it by allowing people to participate in cases.
Great, thanks, Jerry. And remember, everyone, the name of the book is Transcultural Competence, Navigating Cultural Differences in the Global Community. For feedback on today's session, once the webinar closes, you'll be asked if you want to provide feedback to GoToWebinar. Go ahead and click Give Feedback and give the panelists and myself some reactions regarding today's session. In the chat room, if you want to keep getting your questions in there, I see a couple, so we're going to come back to those as we close out. There are some debrief questions that Jerry provided. We're going to put those up on the Nexus for Change LinkedIn, and then we're happy to be a conduit and help continue the conversation going with Jerry and Harris. So thank you both for being here, and also with Graham for being here and the work that you're going to be doing on the interactive ebook. The link to the slides and the recording will be coming out within 48 hours, and then you'll see the Amazon link in the chat room and here on the Chatsy window. But also, if you click on this book right here on the last page of the Nexus slides, that will bring up your the link over to Amazon.com for the book. So let's see. So there's one more. There's a question from Valentina, and she says, "Are there any cases that you know of in higher education organizational change?"
Yeah, lots. My only considered opinion is that higher education happens to be one of the most difficult places to implement change. I'm not quite sure, but in my years of experience in working in higher education, I can just say that it's not the easiest environment. And there are cases, yes. I don't know if we have listed any in the book or not. And I actually worked as a consultant for several universities, one in New Zealand and several others where they were actually implementing change projects. And so, yeah, they have many of the same situations with cultural differences and cultural dilemmas. And let me just point out this, which I didn't point out before. Professional differences in the way that people do things can be some of the greatest diversity that you'll find. I used to sit in boardrooms and corporations and listen to how human resources versus accounting versus marketing versus operations people would look at the same problems. And it was like they may have been from the same country, or they may have appeared to be the same group, but they had very strong cultural differences based on their professional differences. And I think in a university you find that as well, is that many people, not just administrative faculty, support staff, but many people in higher education see things quite differently depending on whether they're a psychologist or whether they're a business person or whether they're in the nursing program or whatever. And we even have a chapter on the cultures of people who study culture. And we think that's very important, because in looking at things like culture, we have to realize that psychologists tend to look at human behavior from an individual lens, whereas an anthropologist like myself tends to look at it from a cultural lens. And that's one of the reasons why Harris and I enjoyed writing the book so much, because he's laughing, because we have different perspectives, even though we've known each other for a long time and shared many interests. The fundamental training one gets in an academic discipline is a prerequisite sometimes to how you see and use culture.
This also was reflected with our relationship with the publisher, APA Books, because we were talking about how oftentimes individual measures of cultural competence are not very relevant, and despite being very explicit about that, we kept getting feedback from our reviewers. Well, what are the measures that we should use? And list them in the appendix. And we responded, but we've just talked about how what we're trying to go for with transcultural competence is something more interactive, where there aren't right or wrong answers or necessarily better individual traits. It's more the fit between the individual and the context, but within the mindset of many of the people from the psychology profession, that was hard to grasp.
Yep. Okay, anything else, John?
Great point, Harris. What's that, Jerry?
I said anything else?
Just some reactions, I think. So I think we're good to end it there. But Harris, that was a great point that you just had in terms of the dilemmas themselves and talking about transcultural competence and how there is gray area, and there needs to be future discussion. And really, it's about being presented with cases and being able to be presented with a framework and work through that framework. So I think that
and that's
what
why
you guys talked about.
Yeah, that's why up front we said that it's very important to have prerequisites for understanding cultural competence, and that first one was cultural relativity and holism and synchronic, diachronic perspectives, and particularly understanding our own biases. And professional disciplines have their own biases, and that's a very important point that we want to make and have made hopefully in the book.
All right, great. So all this information will be sent to you all in about 48 hours. Harris and Jerry, thank you so much for presenting your work and for interacting with our folks here. And Graham, thanks for your help with the chat room and bringing your perspective in as well.
And thank you, John, for helping to make it doable. And everyone who's on the call, thank you for joining us. And as I said, if you want to continue the dialogue, don't hesitate to contact us.
All right. Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, Harris. And thanks, everybody else out there for attending our Nexus for Change Author Sandbox webinar, Transcultural Competence, Navigating Cultural Differences in the Global Community. You guys have a great afternoon or morning or evening, depending on where you are.
People from 7 a.m. time zones to the evening. So we've got people just before breakfast and we got people after dinner. We had people from South Africa down to Hawaii, etc.
Yep. And so thanks everyone for